Hey APUSH kiddos, it is the day before the exam and I'm going to fly through these terms on the required factual information, and my dog has the best life ever. Pretty much she just sleeps. Riley, you going back to sleep again? Anyway, I'm gonna leave her be. So I'm gonna go through these as quickly as I can, and some of them I don't even remember. So hopefully the stuff I do remember will help you. So I haven't spent much time even looking at them, so I'm just going to go through them, and what pops into my mind, that's what I'm going to share with you. Okay, so the first one is Henry Clay. Period 4 is from 1800 to 1848, and we're talking about the end of John Adams' presidency. Hey, baby. The end of John Adams' presidency, all the way till I think we get to James Monroe, Andrew Jackson, I believed Andrew Jackson. So anyway, all right, so Henry Clay was a pretty important person during the early part of American history, 1800s, mid 1800s, leading up to the Civil War. He was a member of the House of Representatives. If you will recall, he also was involved in the corrupt deal between John Quincy Adams and his election. He was the Speaker of the House and put his weight behind John Quincy Adams. He was also the author of the American system that James Madison introduced, that we'll talk about in a second. He was a compromiser, not in a bad way particularly. I think he was from Kentucky. But he was not necessarily in favor of slavery, but he did not want the country to fall apart as a result of the tensions related to slavery. So he was very, very in the middle of everything. He was also I guess you could say, a significant person in the Whig Party. He was in favor of the National Bank. He and Andrew Jackson despised one another for a whole host of reasons, but one of them happens to be the election. The other one happens to be their position on the Bank of the United States. He ran for president. So he's just all over the place. And he died, I believe, right as the Civil War was starting, I think. So Henry Clay. The market revolution is a big theme in period 4. The market revolution talks about it, deals with the advancement, particularly in the transportation sector. You have the advent of the steamboat and railroads, which allows products to be taken from the farm to the cities or vice versa. You have a westward expansion. You no longer have people just doing subsistence farming, which means they're farming to feed their family, but now they're making enough stuff that they can actually sell it for a little bit of a profit to either buy more land or buy things. And this is where you start to see America begin to become a consumer society. You also see the textile industry kind of explodes in New England, and the ability to sell it abroad or transport those goods. The Erie Canal and the canal system that developed during this era, which was again an intent to transport goods to consumers. And so you have kind of a little mini transportation revolution. Let's see what's next on my list here. Second Great Awakening. I believe that was Mr. Charles Finney, is kind of the iconic person. It began in upstate New York. And it spread throughout the country, and this particular awakening was marked by a sense of, I'll call it Pentecostal-like expressions of worship. It was a move away from the Puritan viewpoint of salvation being Calvinistic to people have to make a decision for themselves. Nobody is too far from God's grace. Calvinists would say they watered down the gospel. Finney and his crew would say that the Puritan view of things was too legalistic. And it was, of course, during the Second Great Awakening that the Mormon religion cult was developed. It also took place, began in New York. I think it's called the Burnt Out District of New York, I think is what it's called, it was referred to. So anyway, significant revival in American history. You know that it's significant when secular books, textbooks, are actually talking about it. So it's not just a figment of anybody's imagination. I would also say the Second Great Awakening was a pushback against the market revolution, which there was a perception that it was materialistic in nature, the love of things and money, and which in some ways it was, and a period of general lethargic attitude towards all things religious. Church attendance was down. It seemed that the foundation of America being partly being founded on religious freedom was no more. So that is the Second Great Awakening. The next one says Protestants, and I'm not exactly sure what that means, except for perhaps Protestants were the ones that were primarily the instigators of this Second Great Awakening. Of course, you also have during this period of time, you have a lot of immigrants moving into the country. There was a huge influx of Irish at this time, and the Irish tended to be Catholic. And that impacted life in the cities. It impacted the political lines that were drawn by the political machines, like the Conklins and stuff. Utopian movements, again, this is kind of seated in that transcendentalism, the desire to push back against this materialistic marketplace idea and find peace in nature and in a society that you can control. And so utopian different groups began. They kind of lived in communes together. The one that is popping into my mind is the Shakers, the Shakers. I started to say Quakers. The Shakers, who they were called that for obvious reasons. None of those utopian experiments lasted very long, but they were a manifestation of this era. The book says South, North, and Midwest. So I guess they want you to evaluate how the economies were developing differently. We know what was happening in the South. This is antebellum. Period 4 is antebellum America. So these are the years before the Civil War. The South was certainly developing an economy specifically based on slave trade. The West was expanding, but the area in between was not, except for with the advent of the railroad. It was bringing communities to the Midwest part of the state. People were moving from the Southeast and Old Virginia as their lands were drying out, and they were moving to the Midwest and to the upper parts of Texas and Arkansas to grow cotton. So you see a movement towards those areas specifically for the purpose of raising cotton. Enslaved black, free black African Americans. I'm going to skip that. Of course, the abolitionist movement is roaring during this time. I would say the primary political divide during the years leading up to the end of this period, 1848, of course, is the issue of slavery. What to do about it, how to compromise as the country is growing, that manifest destiny. With each new state that is introduced into the Union, it increases the conflict related to slavery. The advent of the cotton gin, of course, forever sealed the doom of slaves in the South, or the institution of slavery. It was called the old Cotton Kingdom. Sometimes you'll hear the word cotton is king, or the expression cotton is king. Textile industries in New England were dependent on that cotton, as were other parts of the world. I think the book says that at one point, a third of the world's cotton was being manufactured and exported from southern part of the United States. So unfortunately, the institution was there to stay. As far as the abolitionist movement goes, some important names would be Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave and has escaped, and was a powerful speaker, traveled the country sharing his story and the evils of slavery. He was a self-taught, self-read man that was very educated, had educated himself well. I'm trying to think of the name. William Lloyd Garrison was the probably most prominent abolitionist newspaper man. He owned a newspaper called The Emancipator. I think that's correct. And he and Frederick Douglass worked together. I think the book, if I remember correctly, also the book talks about the fact that the abolitionist movement merged at some point with other reform movements, such as women's suffrage movement, the movement to reform the asylums, prison systems, schools, all of those things. So all of those reform movements, including abolition, were joined together. What's the name of the book? Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the years right before the Civil War. She was part of that abolitionist movement as well. The Seneca Falls Convention was, let's see here. I believe it was actually took place in 1848. And this was, you have to know what the Seneca Falls Convention is. If you don't remember anything else, I think Lucy Mott, she's one of the people that introduced the Seneca Falls, and I can't remember the name of the other gal. It may have been Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But the Seneca Falls Convention marks the beginning of the women's suffragette movement. They met in Seneca Falls. Hold on. By the way, my dog is rolling on the floor, scratching her back and making a lot of weird noises. Come here. Anyway, Seneca Falls, you got to know what that is, and it marks the beginning of the women's suffrage or women's rights movement. Come here. Come here. Say hi. Hello. And so, again, just want to emphasize that the women's suffrage movement paired with the abolitionist movement, so a lot of the same people were involved in both of those things. Transportation revolution, we talked about that, particularly steamboats, railroads, the Erie or the canal systems that were developed. It says public and private sphere, and I don't remember what that was talking about. Appalachian Mountains, I'm not sure what they are referencing in that. The Ohio and Mississippi rivers were significant transportation systems, or I'm sorry, trading systems. Once the steamboat was invented, they could go upstream or downstream. So a lot of the, in particular, cotton transportation occurred on those two river systems. I guess the Mississippi. I'm not sure how far down the Ohio goes. Okay, the American system. So let's talk about the presidents really quick. So I'll get to the American system here in a second. So when John Adams left office, he, of course, lost re-election, and he lost to Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson was going to usher in a new era, a smaller government. He tried to shrink the government. He tried to shrink the size of the Navy, no standing army, reduce the amount of money that would go to any of those things. He made the office of president very informal. He would answer the door himself sometimes in his pajamas. He didn't really care for being president, but I think he probably didn't want anybody else to be president. So classic Thomas Jefferson. His big accomplishments during his presidency, probably the most notable or the most memorable, I guess is the word I'm looking for, was the Louisiana Purchase. And so we talked about this, the fact that he was a constitutionalist and wanted to follow the letter of the Constitution. And when his advisors indicated that Napoleon was willing immediately at that moment in time to sell the Louisiana territory to him for really close to nothing, he had to act on it immediately, but he didn't feel like he had the authority or the constitutional power to do that. But he dismissed that uncomfortable feeling and went ahead and did it. Not very many people were bothered by the fact that the Constitution didn't give him the authority to do that. So he doubled the size of the United States. He also fought the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. Excuse me, I'm gonna get a drink of water or drink of coffee. What else with Mr. Jefferson? He kept us out of war with between England and France. Of course, probably the biggest problem was towards the end of his term. He served for 8 years. France and England were at it again, and they were impressing our sailors, taking them off merchant ships and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. And he was sick of it, and so he passed a law, or he signed a law. He didn't. Presidents don't make laws, but he encouraged the Democratic Republicans in Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807, which shut down all trade to all European countries, not just those that we perceive to be our enemies, thereby crippling the economy and crippling merchants all along the seaboard, which he probably wasn't that concerned about. I shouldn't say it that way, but he was more, again, he believed in the rural farming community vision of America. And so he was just mad. He didn't want to deal with it anymore. And so he signed it into law. He kind of rode out the last few months in office. And he suffered from migraines pretty terribly in his second term in office. And so he was unhappy, and he happily went back home to his home in Mount Vernon after his second term ended. Let me see if there's anything else related to him in here. Excuse me, I've got a tickle in my throat. I don't have coronavirus. Okay, yeah, Louisiana Purchase. Okay, after Thomas Jefferson was Raleigh. James Madison, gosh, I couldn't remember. James Madison, of course, the War of 1812. Whole host of things came out of the War of 1812, but not anything that's maybe necessarily related to war. Our national anthem, the burning of the White House, Delhi, Madison rescuing the painting of Washington. James Madison was not a very good president. He was more of a figurehead, and of course he's a brainiac and the father of the Constitution. He did join ranks with Henry Clay. And Henry Clay was the author of the American System, which was a package of bills that would go through Congress that the president was on board with, and it was meant to strengthen the American economy. And the American system involved three things, and I hope I can remember them. A stronger tariff system to protect American manufacturing, transportation systems like particularly the Erie canals, and a national bank. Went back to that again to revive the national bank status. And I think at the very end of his presidency, Madison actually changed his mind on the bank, and that probably had something to do with his relationship with Thomas Jefferson. So that was the American system. Part of the transportation issue also was building roads throughout the United States that did not exist to help with the transportation of goods. And then after Madison was Monroe, and that is known as the era of good feelings. Things were pretty peaceful. We had kind of worked out our problems with the British in the War of 1812. And so James Monroe had it easy going. And he was the last of our founding fathers. He served with George Washington in the American Revolution. He was another Virginian, the whole Virginia dynasty. Washington was from Virginia, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and I don't know who else, but of the first few presidents, most of them were from Virginia. And so he asked John Quincy Adams, who was a prolific diplomat, to be his Secretary of State. And John Quincy Adams wrote something that has become known as the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially said European powers need to stop colonizing Western Hemisphere, that era is over, and we're going to keep our eye on you. And it was an announcement by the president to stay out of here. And it's named after the president because it happened during his presidency. He also was president when the Missouri Compromise was passed. The Missouri Compromise was signed in 1820, and effectively it was an attempt to prevent the spread of slavery into those territories. In the new Louisiana territory that was purchased, and Missouri wanted to come into the Union as a slave state. It had a lot of cotton farms that depended on slave labor. And so the compromise that Congress came up with was that Missouri could enter the Union as a slave state, but nothing else above the southern border of Missouri and north into the Louisiana territory could come into the Union as a slave state. So that temporarily halted the fears of a slave country. And that stood for many, many years until we get closer to the Civil War, when that was thrown out with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and popular sovereignty. Okay, India. They also include Andrew Jackson in this as well. So Andrew Jackson, as you know, James Monroe. Did somebody need something? Yeah. You need to come in? You can come in. I'm going to keep talking. After James Monroe left office, John Quincy Adams became president, and there was a troubling election. There were three people that had a significant number of votes, but none of them had a majority. It was John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Andrew Jackson. And I believe of the three of them, Andrew Jackson had the most votes. So on popular vote, he won, but he didn't meet a majority threshold. And the Constitution says that if there is no clear winner or a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives, where each state gets to cast a vote, and their delegations get together and decide. And in this case, Henry Clay, as I said before, was the Speaker of the House, and he supposedly made a corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams, saying, I will put my weight behind you if you will make me Secretary of State. I don't know if that was actually a conversation that they had, but that is what happened. He put his weight behind John Quincy Adams, and then John Quincy Adams chose Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. And in years the past, including John Quincy Adams, that was a road to the White House. That was a path to the presidency if you became Secretary of State. Thomas Jefferson had also been Secretary of State. And so Andrew Jackson threw a fit, screamed from the rafters, there's been a corrupt bargain, and I am the victim. And so he made John Quincy Adams 4 years miserable. John Quincy Adams was unable to get anything accomplished. All of his visions and dreams for a national university and a national highway system and a national observatory and all of this stuff, none of it ended up coming to fruition because Congress believed that he had made a corrupt bargain, and so effectively shut him down. So he leaves office miserable. He becomes the second person in history up to that point to only serve one term, as did his father. Of course, Andrew Jackson wins the next time around, and his era as president is known as the era of Jackson, and he ushers in this real laid back, casual, nonchalant, kind of wild west attitude and feeling and demeanor to the White House. In fact, at Inauguration Day, he threw a party and basically invited everybody to the White House, and the common folk trashed the place, broke the White House china, got a little drunk, and the Quinceyites were just horrified. If Abigail had been alive, she would have, just, And so it was a bad situation for the Federalists, but it was not a bad situation for what are going to become the Democrats. The name Democrat begins to shift primarily with Andrew Jackson, I think. And so he becomes the face of the Democrat Party. He fights with Joseph Biddle and the National Bank. He doesn't want it, he doesn't want it, he doesn't want it, and he's going to do everything he can to shut it down. Joseph Biddle had been horrible to him and said terrible things to him. Andrew Jackson's wife had died at the beginning of actually before he even took office, I believe, from a heart attack. People accused him of being a polygamist because she had not gotten divorced, I guess legally or correctly, from her first husband, although they'd been married for like 35 years. And so he had a lot of vengeance and flowing through his blood when he took office in the White House. He had what was known as the kitchen cabinet. He kept firing all of his advisors and inviting his friends to come in through the kitchen door and advise him, did whatever he wanted to do. John C. Calhoun was his vice president, and he and John C. Calhoun did not get along. Calhoun was from South Carolina, and while Andrew Jackson was a Southerner, he believed in he believed in federal power and a united states. He did not believe, he believed that federal power trumped state power, although he kind of walked the fine line on that. And so when Calhoun threatened to secede or to lead South Carolina in a secession because of a tariff that Andrew Jackson had signed, the abominable tariff that Andrew Jackson had signed into law, he threatened to lead South Carolina in either nullification, which if you remember, make sure you know if you remember what that word means, that the states had the right to nullify federal laws, or they thought that they did. And South Carolina was either going to nullify this tariff law because it adversely affected their farmers, or they were going to secede. So you start hearing that talk of secession. And Andrew Jackson, I don't know if I've been saying Andrew Johnson. If I have been, I'm sorry. Andrew Jackson threatened to go down to South Carolina and hang John C. Calhoun personally, and apparently Calhoun was fairly frightened of Andrew Jackson, which he should have been. Andrew Jackson wins the war against the bank. He kills the bank, and Henry Clay is also part of that destruction. He hates Henry Clay. And then when he leaves office, he has taken all of the tax deposits out of the Bank of the United States and deposited them in private banks probably around the Capitol or the South. And the federal government has no debt when he leaves office, which we think that would be a good thing, but actually it really just destroyed the economy. So as he leaves office, the economy collapses, and his vice president, Martin Van Buren, is left to deal with the mess. And so I think that brings me to the end of the terms on this list. Oh, obviously the Indian Removal Act. Forgot to mention that one. That's kind of important. So Andrew Jackson, I don't want to say he hated all Indians, but I think he hated all Indians. He believed that the solution to the Indian conflict was to move them out of the way. If we get rid of them and give them their own place somewhere else. We won't fight them anymore. And so it was actually his first piece of legislation that he signed. He wanted them out of here. He wanted all Indians east of the Mississippi removed from all of that land in the United States. And so it wasn't even fully accomplished until Martin Van Buren's presidency, but that was one of his first acts of business. So he is associated with the Indian Removal Act. Okay, period 4 is done.